Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of Rewind, the Shenson Retrospective Film Series. It is my honor and delight to introduce our esteemed guests today. I'll introduce myself as well. I'm Shana Hammerman. I'm the Associate Director of Jewish Studies at Stanford. First, we have Ariel Mayse, the Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Stanford, and of course, a member of the Jewish Studies core faculty. He is currently in the publication process of The Shores of Devotion, Law, Ritual, and Mysticism in Early Hasidism, an attempt to rethink Hasidic teachings, ritual, and relationships to God with Stanford University Press. And we welcome Ariel and his expertise on Hasidic thought today. Also, Professor Gabriella Safran, the Ava Chernavloki Professor of Jewish Studies, and really the sort of authority on Ansky and the Dybbuk. She wrote, among other things, Wandering Soul, the Dybbuk's creator as Ansky. And finally, I'm going to say it, the brain father of the Rewind series, Dr. Eitan Kensky, the Reinhardt family curator of Hebraica and Judaica at Stanford Libraries. Welcome, everyone. And as a reminder, please put your questions into the Q&A at any time.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Shana, for the introduction. Thank you, Eitan, for giving birth to this series. I'm happy to speak today a little bit about the Dybbuk, the film, the Dybbuk. I'll explain a little bit more about sort of where I come from with this project. I teach in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures here at Stanford, so my expertise is in Russian and also the Russian language and Yiddish language, Jewish literature of the Russian Empire. So I'm really interested in this like Russian context. And coming out of that, I did a whole series of projects related to S. Ansky. S. Ansky was a Russian and Yiddish writer, a revolutionary, a pretty serious revolutionary, part of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and also an ethnographer. His real name was Shloime Zanvil Rappaport, but he went by Ansky. He was born in 1863 and he died in 1920. He's best known for he did lots and lots of incredibly interesting stuff. You know, buy the biography that I wrote of him and read it, and you will find out all about that interesting stuff. But he's known really for a single work. He's best known for a single work, the Dybbuk, which he wrote as a play, not a screenplay, but a play. He wrote it in Russian originally. He started writing it in 1913. He kept working on it through at least 1916. He wrote it first in Russian, he translated it into Yiddish, it was then translated into Hebrew, and it this text lived kind of different lives in these different languages. It's a play that he wrote, that Ansky wrote, coming out of his experiences as an ethnographer. So Ansky led these ethnographic expeditions to Jewish Ukrainian villages, shtetls. He did so in the 3 years leading up to World War I. These were kind of modern ethnographic expeditions in that he went with a photographer and a phonograph so he could record songs, and he brought with him sort of a number of researchers. So they were these expeditions with a bunch of people who would kind of descend on a shtetl and record and listen to stories and sort of get a lot of information and maybe buy some antiquities and then move on to another little village. And I think that this play that he wrote, kind of coming out of the expedition, in a way has something to do with the expedition itself, right? The experience of being an ethnographer. Part of what happens when you are an ethnographer in the early 20th century using a gramophone to record voices is that you spend a lot of time talking with the people whose voices you are recording about what it means to record a voice and make someone else's words kind of detachable from their body. So their words can sound coming out of a machine, coming out of a record, a wax cylinder in this case, as opposed to coming out of, an actual flesh human body. And that notion of the voice being detachable was eerie and disturbing, uncanny to, but also fascinating and exciting to Ansky and his interlocutors on the expedition. And I think that the play, the Dybbuk, is in part about a kind of reflection on what it means for the voice to be detachable and what it means for Leia to speak with the voice of Ronan, what it means for Ronan to kind of live on after his body is dead. We see this as made possible by the Dybbuk, by Ronan turning into a Dybbuk, but we could also think of this being made possible by Ronan turning into a kind of a recording. And of course, it's an exciting thing about film that it allows for all different kinds of recording that are uncanny. It's also, I think, important to understand that for Ansky, the impulse to write the play, the Dybbuk, was kind of came out of the desire, the same impulses that prompted him to undertake his ethnographic expeditions, which was the impulse to gather the old culture, the old Eastern European Jewish culture that he thought was dying, and to transform it into a modern form, to remake it in a modern form where it would become more sustainable, where it would be able to be circulated and would appeal to people and would live on somehow. So Ansky believed, incorrectly as it turned out, that traditional Jewish religion would die out, and the culture associated with it would also die out. It actually hasn't died out, but he thought it would, and so he was really inspired to learn about it, make this play, also to make an ethnographic expedition, to make an ethnographic museum about Jewish culture, which he did. So the play is in a way a museum. The play is analogous to his project of creating a museum. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of the play before it gets turned into the movie that you saw. So he wrote the play in Russian. He wanted it to be performed by the Moscow Art Theater. That's the theater associated with Konstantin Stanislavski, like the Stanislavski method, like method acting and Hollywood. So he thought it would be performed by the Moscow Art Theater. He entered into negotiations with the Moscow Art Theater, with Stanislavski. But then when World War I broke out, Stanislavski said to him, "Your play is too much of a downer, and now in this time of war, people would rather watch comedies, so sorry, we're not going to perform your play." So around that time, the play was translated into Hebrew by Chaim Nachman Bialik, great Hebrew poet, and it then got offered to the Hebrew studio of the Moscow Art Theater. The Hebrew studio is the Habima Theater, the Habima Studio. And they did, in fact, perform it to great acclaim in Hebrew, in Moscow, in Soviet Moscow, starting in 1922. At the same time, the play, which he wrote in Russian, Ansky translated it into Yiddish, and he attempted to get it performed in Yiddish when he realized it wouldn't be performed in Russian. Lots of things happened in Ansky's life, as a result of which he was first part of the new revolutionary government after the first Russian Revolution of 1917. Then after the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks took over, Ansky had to flee. So because he was part of a different revolutionary party, right? So he had to flee. He ended up in Vilna, what's now Vilnius, Lithuania, and there he tried to get his play in Yiddish performed by a Vilna Yiddish theater troupe. And it finally was performed by that troupe in 1920. The first performance was 30 days after Ansky's own death. So Ansky died in 1920, and then the Vilna troupe performed this play kind of as a memorial to him, but to their own surprise, the play was unbelievably successful. And they performed it in Warsaw. They were it was so popular, they sort of kept performing it in the theater, kept being sold out night after night. There's these legends that the trolley in Warsaw would stop by the theater where the Dybbuk was being performed, and the conductor would call, "This is the Dybbuk stop. Everyone get out to watch the Dybbuk." So it was very popular. It was popular to Jewish audiences, to non-Jewish audiences, to middle-brow audiences, but also to Jewish cultural activists who really wanted Jews to have a kind of highbrow culture, a kind of modernist culture, like as the Poles had. So it was perceived as doing a lot of things for a lot of people. So this background, I think, should help us understand why this play was turned into a movie, the movie that you just saw. So it was produced as a movie in 1937. It's the most famous Polish Yiddish movie. The producer who's in charge of it, Michał Waszyński, was a kind of rising star, a kind of artsy theater professional who was Jewish, but was not someone who had worked previously with Yiddish texts. We can see the film as demonstrating the kind of avant-gardeness, the up-to-the-minuteness of Waszyński, the kind of trends of the period. It's expressionist. If you've seen any German expressionist films, you will recognize that. It has this kind of dark, exaggerated use of black and white. It's mannered, it's stylized, right? This is not a movie that's trying to be maximally realist at every moment. It's a movie that's trying to be visually striking at every moment, and those are very different goals. At the same time, we could argue that this movie does continue some of the work that Ansky began, because Ansky was interested in ethnography and ethnographic realism and documenting a world that he thought was on its way out. And you can see that even as the movie has all of this like exaggerated, mannered, black and white stuff, it also has a lot of, it demonstrates that a lot of work has gone into very careful ethnographic research. There's very precise costumes. There's very precise reproduction of bodily behavior. There's very precise dances. The choreographer for the movie, Judith Berg, did a huge amount of research on Jewish dance. And the most famous dance in the film is the Dance of Death, the Teutentanz, which Berg, based on memories of seeing that kind of dance that her grandmother had had. So her grandmother told her about seeing people dance in this way, and Berg put that in the film that you saw. Some of the people who performed in the play are really experts in Jewish culture, kind of coming from the inside. Best known, the singer Shirota, a famous cantor. Other people who performed in the play were people who kind of came from the outside. They were very assimilated Polish Jews who were not part of the shtetl world that's depicted in the film. Some of the actors, for instance, Liliana, the actor who played Leia, had to learn Yiddish in order to take on the role. She was not a native speaker of Yiddish. She was a very assimilated Polish Jew, didn't know Yiddish. And of course, Waszyński himself didn't know Yiddish when he took on this play, when he took on this film. He too was really kind of an assimilated Polish Jew, kind of coming from the outside. The film, like the play, was a tremendous success, kind of unexpected success. The film was a success in Poland. It was shown in New York, around the world. It was controversial as well at the time. Now we watch this film and we see it as a monument to a set of worlds that are now gone, right? We see it as a monument to the pre-war world of the shtetl, of the small Eastern European Jewish market town. We see it as, at the same time, as a monument to interwar Polish Yiddish cinema, another world that's gone. The film has taken on a kind of aura, which is connected to our knowledge of the fate of the people who were involved in making it. Many of those people, of course, perished during the Holocaust. Not all of them. The actors who played Leah and Ronen survived. They came to the United States in the late 1930s after the film was shot, and they just happened to be there when the war broke out. But that's not the case with the other actors. So it's hard for us now, I think, not to see this movie as gesturing toward the Holocaust that was, going to happen, going to begin a few years after the movie was made. And I want to kind of respect our impulse to see the movie that way. And at the same time, I think we need to, it's helpful for us also to see the movie as coming out of its own place and time and having meanings to its original audiences that are not necessarily the same as the meanings that it might have to us now. I thought it was really interesting that Eitan asked me and Ariel to look at these two movies that you watched for today together, and to ask the question of, is this horror? What does it mean to think of the Dybbuk as a horror movie? I admit I am not a horror movie watcher, so I'm an outsider to this genre. I can't really speak with any authority. I watched Tikkun. I felt like, well, that seems more horrifying than the Dybbuk. The Dybbuk seems very tame in relation to Tikkun. But there are all these ways, I guess, that we could see the Dybbuk, the film of the Dybbuk, as horror. It foregrounds death. It foregrounds death in the dance of death, in the death of Ronen, in the many references to the grave of the bride and groom killed on their wedding day. The fundamental idea of a person who comes back from the dead and then succeeds in bringing people back with him from the world of the living back into the world of the dead, that I think feels like horror to me. And of course, this what I just mentioned, the fact that we watch this movie now and have trouble maybe seeing it as not referencing the horror of the Holocaust, that makes it also that also is a way that we can understand this movie as being part of the genre of horror. Okay, I think I've used up all of my minutes, and now it is Ariel's turn.
Thank you, Gabriella, for a characteristically wonderful and interesting introduction to a brilliant and timeless classic. Always great to learn from you. And Eitan, thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. I am a great fan of horror. I really enjoy books and movies within this orbit. I found myself deeply conflicted about Tikkun, and I'll say a few words about that perhaps toward the end of my remarks here. Tikkun is a fascinating movie. It's kind of an entree into what we might describe as a very small cinematic subgenre of Hasidic noir. Now, Eitan, you're going to tell me that you can think of a dozen other movies that fit into that, but we'll have that conversation when we get there. Noir in the sense of not only the coloring and the schematics, but also the complete package of cynicism and darkness and absurdity. It is a tale of repression more than redemption, of awakening and death, and life and death. It's a story of the encounters between the secular and religious worlds and the complex interface in between them. I would say that's a theme that's especially of moment for the Israeli audience. It's a little bit less understandable to us in America, but I think it's key to this film. We meet in this the protagonist, Chaim Aaron, who is a pious, devout, and troubled member of a Hasidic community in what we're given to understand as Mea She'arim, the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem, which is distinguished not only by its tremendous piety and the way that people live in very close quarters with one another and to a certain degree form an entirely insular community, but it's also one that is at the boundaries of many different secular communities, and this geographically is key. Chaim Aaron is as I said, a pious but depressed student. He struggles with what it means to, and this is I think the key theme, what it means to have a body. what it means to have a body complete with all of the sexual connotations and capacities that we have as human beings. So he's embattled not so much against the dictates of religion per se, or of God, who he professes to love, but with his perceptions that the body stands in the way of any kind of religious attainment. One early crucial scene of this movie, I guess kind of like Psycho, a movie that we might compare it with, is the shower scene. But in this scene, when Chaim Aron begins to fall prey to his own autosexual impulses, he's overtaken by an explosion, almost a kind of ejaculation of water from the shower, which then causes him to fall down. He hits his head, and at that point, all attempts to revive him by Hatzalah, by the paramedics, the EMTs, fail. But in a striking inversion, and almost against all odds, and in a striking inversion of the biblical story of the binding of Isaac, his father, brings him back to life. Now, of course, the father's job is that he is a slaughterer. So this agent of death becomes an agent of life. But as we see throughout the second part of the film, it's a kind of half life, not in the sense of endurance, but in the sense of it being a shadow of what it was. The father continues to struggle with the question as to whether or not he has thwarted God's will. Chaim Aron struggles with a whole host of things, including the fact he's no longer the same. He's not the same Chaim Aron that he was. All the troubles have been amplified. He cannot sleep. He does not fit in with his community. He does not fit in with his peers. He does not fit in with his teachers. Conformity, exterior forms of conformity are all the same. He's alive. His body is there. And yet that which is inside, perhaps that which is defining him as a human being, is overwhelmed by too many thoughts. He also doesn't fit in with the natural world. He lies down on the grass and is discomforted even there. He's discomforted when he sees meat. He's discomforted when he encounters anything in his world. He doesn't fit in with the secular culture on whose margins he lives. In his encounter with a prostitute, he asks for her name. That's the sort of opening bit of their sexual encounter. And that foils the liaison between them, perhaps interestingly, perhaps ironically, because the connection of a name is too off-puttingly intimate. He discovers, although he doesn't really consummate his encounter with sexuality toward the end, but the movie portrays that as wrapped up with death. The death of a woman who had given him a ride, perhaps with his own death, tying together, not in a neat bow, but in a kind of unruly Gordian knot, the themes of Eros and Thanatos. Themes that I see as echoing within this story are gender and sexuality. Women here are largely instruments of the exploration of the inner world and physical world of Chaim Aron. That's a choice on the behalf of the filmmakers, one that in certain senses really mirrors the cultural assumptions of the movie, the culture that the movie attempts to portray. Obviously, sexuality is a key one here. The modern Hasidic movement is, and the modern Hasidic community in Israel in particular, and in Mea Shearim in particular within that, is correctly known as not only the most extreme in terms of pietism and its unwillingness to in any way brook change that is brought on by modernity, it's also known as a community in which sexual abstinence and sexual penitence and human sexuality itself are very complicated subjects. And there are actually within many of these communities, how should we describe these takanot, ordinances that really, in a way, over and above anything determined by Jewish law, in fact, actually countermanding some of the sexual laws of halacha, raise abstinence and a deep sort of antipathy towards sexuality to an entirely new level. The film grapples with mystery, with the unknowing, nature of human life. It grapples with issues of language. That's true both in the name scene. It's also true, and perhaps, Gabriella, we can talk about this, in the way that the film code switches in between Hebrew and Yiddish in ways that are sometimes feeling random and sometimes perhaps not. And obviously, one of the great questions of this movie is, and the great themes, the idea of tikkun in general. Tikkun is it's a rife word. It's a robust word. It's a ripe word. It's one that is filled with meaning. The term is an ancient one. It goes back all the way into the hoary imagination of the Jewish past. It's given new meaning in the 16th century by Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist of Tzfat, from whom much of modern Kabbalah and in some ways Hasidism itself emerges. Tikkun in that context means not only setting something right or correcting it, but it means a kind of cosmic rectification. It can mean that on the divine plane, and it can also mean that in the intra sort of human plane, in which the fracture that defines an individual's life, or perhaps a previous life, is set right. Question I open up is, what is the tikkun that is being described here? Is it the tikkun of the father's mistake in having saved the child? Ironically, he's beleaguered by this belief that he has thwarted God's will. Is it the tikkun of the body that has finally been healed, ironically, through death and transcendence? Is it the tikkun of some past misdeed? We don't exactly know. Tikkun is an unsettling film. I found it often drifting toward a kind of absurdity and randomness that felt like the explorations were definitely not as tightly connected as they needed to be. On the other hand, I found it to be a compelling, if again, unsettling film. I would put it into conversation with, let's say, three other bodies of cinematic accomplishment. One of the ancient, by now, century-old early progenitors of modern horror and noir. Nosferatu comes to mind, as does The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's also in conversation with films like Kadosh, another Israeli movie about sexual abstinence in the ultra-Orthodox community. We might also add to this Shtisel, which is I would say a more thoughtful portrayal of the ultra-Orthodox community in certain respects. But as I was watching this movie, another set of films and literatures that came to mind are those of American Jewish stories, Portnoy's Complaint for obvious reasons, but I was hit over the head with this several times. This felt like, in many respects, an Israeli translation of A Serious Man, which is in some sense the Coen brothers' the Coen brothers film, which is in some sense such a quintessentially American story about suburban Judaism. And yet so many of the themes are redolent here in this depiction of what it means to be a body and an embodied human being in 20th or 21st century ultra-Orthodox Jerusalem. So maybe we can use that as our opening gambit.
Great, thank you very much. And hopefully Gabriella will rejoin us too. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing those really exciting opening thoughts. It's very easy to me, and this is going to pick up on some of the things that you've both touched upon. It's very easy to me to imagine how we could have included the Dybbuk in any number of potential film programs. You know, we could do a program on Yiddish cinema or adapting Jewish literature, to name just two kind of obvious examples. Maybe interwar Jewish film could be another. Now, Tikkun also could fit easily into a series on new directions in Israeli cinema, or the Frum Imaginary, or a dedicated program on the cinematography of Shai Goldman, since this film is such a showcase of his work. But we're approaching both movies today through the lens of horror, and specifically as examples of something I think we can call Jewish horror. So asking you both to reflect a little more broadly on this particular notion, I'm curious if this horror framing was at all helpful to you. Was it useful to contextualize the Dybbuk not as a companion to Yiddle Mitten Fiddle and the film version of, say, of Mendel as The Light Ahead, two contemporary classics, but within a filmic tradition of expressionist horror? Ariel mentioned Nosferatu, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, these kind of stark early horror works that were very influential. We can also think of it within a context of universal horror movies. And by that, I mean American film company Universal and their monster movies that were very, very popular and dealt with the kind of horrors of World War I, as we talked about with Jeremy Dalber last quarter. Or to take the case of Tikkun, what does it mean that this film seems to be as much in dialogue with David Lynch's Eraserhead, as with the Dybbuk? So is horror a useful framing for these films? And do we think that there is anything resembling a kind of defined genre of Jewish horror?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll answer first because I know so much less about horror than Ariel does. I really don't ever watch horror movies, although I have watched Nosferatu. And since I teach classes on folklore, I've found myself teaching Dracula over and over and over. If you teach folklore and you're a Slavist, you have to teach about vampires. So I do know something about vampires and vampire movies. I usually, insofar as I present Ansky and the Dybbuk in a generic context, I tend to talk about the Gothic and the idea of a kind of Jewish Gothic that includes Ansky and Yud Peretz and maybe Isaac Bashevis Singer, and in which there's there's a tremendous interest in the fluidity of the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Or in Yiddish, you would say, this world and the true world. The true world is the world of the dead. So that I think is that interest is characteristic of the Gothic in general. The Gothic is interested in lighting, dark lighting, shadowy lighting, and so we see that in this film, and we see it, I think, also in Bashevis and Peretz and Ansky's fiction. And I think we see a kind of a Gothic, often Gothic texts involve somebody looking for knowledge and actually getting some kind of knowledge. Maybe it's bad knowledge, maybe it's scary knowledge, but they're kind of seeking for something and then they get something, they learn something. Maybe they learn it at the moment of their death or something, but often they don't, like in, Dracula, like you can win, you can learn about the forces of evil and you can defeat them using the correct, devices. And that I think is kind of permissible within the Gothic. And so I think we can, it lets one see, it facilitates a reading of this movie as kind of the triumph of Ansky. Ansky, Yechonin and Leah, they die, but Ansky actually also dies. But we can sort of see the movie and as the play as being this kind of emblematic of the possibility of cultural knowledge living on, right? They die, but we, the viewers, get this kind of life-giving resource of this text, this artistic text that contains in a kind of condensed way an enormous amount of cultural data that I think Ansky is hoping we're going to use. Right. And I think that's a way that we can continue to watch the Dybbuk. We could be like, wow, it contains so much information. This is great. And that's something to do with the way that the Dybbuk lives on as a play and a movie that, keeps being remade. Right. That I think is not horror. Right. I don't think, and I'll be really fascinated to hear what the two of you have to say, but I don't think of horror as having that kind of sort of celebratory, pedagogical mood that I think we can understand the Gothic as having, and we can understand the film as having.
So I too found the category of horror less helpful for thinking about the D-Book, although if we think about it as in dialogue with something like Nosferatu, there are certain parallels of the story and certain parallels in the questions that they leave open and also the triumphs that they unveil. But if we understand horror in its common iteration to be films or works of literature that are intended to and intensively given to instilling fear, disgust, repugnance, dread, right? We could go on and on. Sometimes catharsis, often not, although catharsis comes by the experience thereof, even if it's not fully expunged by the tale itself. I don't find that to be helpful for the Dybbuk. I find it extremely helpful for Tikkun, which I watched with horror a lot, a great deal of it. I think that not all ghost stories are horror films. Not all supernatural stories are horror films, and not all films that deal with very disturbing and disgusting elements are horror. Not all violent films are horror. This is a particular subcategory. And I think it works for Tikkun. Particularly, I would say it's a psychological horror film or a surrealist horror film. Eraserhead, I think, is a good intertext there. David Lynch, I think, is sort of like hiding behind this. It felt almost like we were watching certain dimensions of either that or Blue Velvet or other kinds of movies that came to mind. I remember hearing an interview with Stephen King many years ago, and when Stephen King was talking about people who read his books, he mentioned adolescents or people around adolescents who read it. And one of the things that he noted is that oftentimes there's a deep ambivalence toward whether or not we should be allowing those in formative years to read something like this. And he said that one of the people that he was talking to about this said that their kid said something very, very powerful, which was, I need to read these books, Mom or Dad. You have no idea how unbelievably scary the world is to me. I need these books. And I found that to be very eye-illuminating because it's not all tied up with a bow in movies like Tikkun or in many horror stories which end on notes that again instill repugnance, dread, and all these other emotions. But somehow the catharsis is that we have a vehicle for thinking with or thinking through those feelings. I guess a question that I would then raise is, who's the intended audience of Tikkun? It's an also interesting question to think about in terms of the reception history of the Dybbuk, which, Gabriella, as you pointed out, has endless layers and has had many different audiences in many different places in many different languages. Tikkun is never going to, and for good reason, approach such status. But it's fascinating to think, who is it meant to install the horror in? Instill, perhaps.
Ariel, you made what to me was a fairly provocative comment that the supernatural alone or ghost stories alone do not constitute horror. And I want to dwell on this because maybe if they don't do it alone, maybe we could think of a combination of things that maybe together would. So Ansky famously gave the Dybbuk a second title, Between Two Worlds. It strikes me that this framework really actually works nicely with both films. The Dybbuk as spirit exists between life and death, and the movie tells us to pay particular attention to that line between reality and dream, vor and cholem. So Tikkun is also obsessed with lines. I really think it's a movie about lines, between sin and expiation, between desecration and sanctification, between faith and apostasy, between life and death. So while these are common themes in a lot of modern Jewish literature and film, I'm wondering if one way to define Jewish horror, with horror here in quotes, is the kind of baseline acceptance of the supernatural within Judaism, that the righteous really are threatened by evil spirits, that there are such things as wandering souls, that prophecy exists and that it makes itself known through visions of crocodiles and knives, Or maybe what we can say is that Jewish horror is a kind of particular pairing of the supernatural and these borders with these larger questions of kind of faith and apostasy, and sin and expiation, life and death. Could this suffice as a working definition? Would it include enough things?
I mean, maybe would it exclude enough things? I guess I feel like I'm in the process of this quarter, I'm meeting with some grad students in literature every week to read classic Yiddish texts in Yiddish, which is great. I'm glad we have a little group of students who want to read classic Yiddish texts, and we're going through and reading them. And, you know, references to this world and the other world, the border between this world and the other world, they're everywhere. And if it's not that, then there's this other, you know, important kind of fluid border that's in Tikkun, which is the relationship between the world of Mea Shearim and the world that you can get to on the bus from Mea Shearim, or maybe even walk to, or get hitchhike to, right? Sort of secular Israeli culture. It's hard to think of a single work of Yiddish literature that doesn't think about either the relationship between the world of the living and the world of the dead, or the relationship between the secular world, the world of the non-Jews, and the kind of traditional Jewish world. Like it's too much everywhere for it to be horror, for us to equate that with horror. It seems to me. But I can be argued out of this. And again, I don't know much about horror, so we'll see what Ariel says.
I'm going to argue you into it because I think you're exactly right. Eitan, I love what you said. On the other hand, if that's your working definition, then the Talmud is probably another great work of Jewish horror. And, you know, our colleague Danny Boyarin's points about the grotesque dimensions of the Gemara are very well taken. And I think that many of the themes that you highlighted there are also present in classical and canonical works of Jewish literature all throughout, and that's certainly true of the works of 16th century Tzfat, the explorations of body and soul, and sin and transgression, and expiation, as you put it, or redemption, or as healing, as the movie would have it. The thin lines in between this world and the other world, between that which is real and that which is truly real, which is the supernatural, and all of these things, those are intensely present in those literatures also. The same is true of classical Hasidic literature and so forth. So whether it's, you know, I once read something that described horror films as the kind of repugnant stories that give you a adrenaline spike to go along with it, which I think works for some but not all horror movies. This one doesn't give me an adrenaline spike. It makes me, I don't even know, run the opposite direction in many respects. But that's also a part of what horror is meant to do. I think it's the affective dimension that I think is really key to understanding horror, whether it's the demonic or zombiotic or the slasher or the witch or the psychological dimension of horror.
So I want to ask one more framing question before we move on to kind of the movies more properly. So the classic Yiddish writer Ariel Peretz famously repurposed the form and substance of the Hasidic story for his kind of Enlightenment ends. You know, stories of miracle working rebbes were secularized, turned into vehicles for ethical instruction. You know, Peretz named this reappropriation Hasidish, in a Hasidic fashion or style. And it inspired a large number of followers, and Ansky and the Dybbuk clearly follow Peretz, though in a way that isn't exactly faithful to what Peretz maybe was intending. So I was thinking about this style and this literary tradition of keeping the form of the story, you know, while rewatching Tikkun and trying to decide what to make of its particular portrayal of the Hasidic milieu. So my question is, I think, kind of twofold. Is, you know, can we slide Tikkun into a tradition of Hasidish, of creatively betraying the form of these traditional stories and storytelling styles for alternate ends? And to some extent, you know, would this genre of Hasidish help explain the recent explosion of stories about Hasidic culture, you know, like Shtisel that Ariel mentioned? And then if that's the case, you know, where do stories about Hasidim end and Hasidish stories begin?
I mean, we could think of the movie Tikkun as taking the movie The Dybbuk as its Hasidic legend. I mean, the movie The Dybbuk is not a Hasidic legend. It's modern cinema, piece of modern cinema, piece of cinema from the 1930s. But we can see Tikkun as saying, okay, I'll take some elements, I'll keep part of the form, and I'll imbue it with new content. I'll fill it with new content. I'll keep, the black hats, the clothes, the ethnographically correct costumes, the ethnographically impressively researched dancing, the young man who's searching for new ways, new paths, the fasting, the going to the mikveh, the exorcism scene, the black and white, the spooky lighting, the kind of expressionist use of color or lack of color, the kind of silent, the sort of gestures toward or like memory of silence, right? Silent cinema when the alligator comes out of the toilet. The kind of idea of someone who's living, who is in love with or sort of sexually drawn to someone who's dead, which is central to the Dybbuk. And that's part of that really disturbing necrophilic scene at the end of Tikkun, the fog, the not needing to be realist. You could see Tikkun as saying, okay, that's the form, and I'm going to use it, and I can use all of it. Watch me use all of it, but I don't have to. It doesn't have to be kind of educational and maybe even somehow redemptive, and also kind of very like satisfying in its romantic, construction and ending. I don't have to do that. I can use these other things. That's the form, and because I'm so faithful to those elements of the form, my flouting of the content rules will attract your attention and kind of be exciting. And maybe it's just one more element of the like uncanny. It's one more thing that we find grotesque and disturbing, is this jarring juxtaposition of the familiar from the Dybbuk, Hasidic maybe form, with the unfamiliar content.
I think the term uncanny is a really helpful one, which we might rescue from Heidegger and apply here as a very, very useful way of thinking about the juxtaposition, as you put it, of things that feel like they are close enough together that it doesn't just feel beyond the pale, as it were, but so far apart and so alarmingly dissimilar that the audience's eyes drift in different directions or in the same direction, and we get kind of confused in ways that are often genuinely unpleasant and intentionally so. Tikkun, at least, is an interruptive film that feels like, as with many of the modern and then postmodern iterations of the Bildungsroman, it ends horribly, and it shows that arousal and awakening and enlightenment are really disquieting and really problematic and really unrooting or uprooting in the effect that they have. And yet the seeds of discontent in this film are not simply exterior, they're really sewn into the fabric of the character that we meet for Chaim Aron. He is one who is even before he goes through his horrific transformation, he is deeply unsettled and deeply unhappy and at home in neither of the multiple worlds that he lives in. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it.
Ariel, I think you really unpacked Tikkun very nicely earlier, and in particular some of the strange prophetic notions and dreams that appear in the film as kind of relating to this father and his internal questioning and metaphor. And that reminds me a lot of the Gothic and the use of spirits in place of psychology and so forth. But I think we could also say that the Tikkun kind of makes a switch from, and it's wrong to call that movie literal and straightforward, but it does make a bit of a switch from this literal, straightforward into a kind of more allegorical storytelling in its second half. And this was clearer to me on rewatch of the film. It's a little less random than it might appear maybe initially, but it seems like the allegory has to do with this crossing over from the religious world into the secular world, and that there's a sequence of drivers or ferrymen who kind of enable this crossing of boundary, and they take him into the profane and to kind of increasing levels of profane, and his final death seems to be a kind of literalization of the idea that apostasy is to be treated as a kind of death, that you mourn this person that has disappeared, or kind of the final confrontation between the family in deciding not to intercede is a kind of multi-pronged awareness on both sides that this passing over has to take place, no matter what it might mean for them. So I'm wondering if you accept the kind of allegorical framing, of this film, and thinking that it might have this kind of allegorical level. And second, if it is allegory, how do we respond to some of the specificity of its imagery? The fog, the cow that is sacrificed, but also not sacrificed. The crocodile or alligator, whichever one that is. And finally, to go back to your earlier point, Ariel, which is that tikkun is multifaceted. So what here seems to be the most implied tikkun? What do we think the filmmaker is pointing to, or is it left completely open or possibly multivalent?
I think it's certainly multivalent. Um, I don't know. How far do you have to go into any movie that deals with many of these themes to encounter fog? I don't think it's so far. I'm thinking about the famous scene in the Japanese movie Ugetsu, um, which is this sort of interesting, romantic, also surreal, also the tale of ghosts, in which there's this really famous scene about crossing a river. Is it a river or a lake? I don't remember. I think it's certainly a body of water where the protagonists are coming through and they're surrounded by fog, and it's just minutes long, and it's not clear where they are going or what's happening, or are they alive or dead. This, I think, is one of the key themes that you find in many movies like this. Eitan, to your point about, sorry, I didn't answer this part of the question. I wanted to just say one more thing about it, about the way that this feels like a Hasidic or super Hasidic or non-Hasidic movie. Slash tale. Yes to all of the comparisons that we've drawn earlier. I think another one is that I don't think it's awful, but really bad movie called I think it's called The Price Above Rupees, with Renee Zellweger, about what it means to be in the Hasidic community in New York and all the hypocrisy, especially around issues of gender. It was a terrible film, but that's another sort of film that was made by an outsider that plays on many of the stereotypes, some of which are correct and some of which are ridiculous, that you find in this particular film also. In terms of the tikkun, the ending of the film brings it back to the father. And the father adorned in the accoutrement of religion, sitting there with his talis and tefillin, looking for inspiration, and for everything that we can think, for everything that we can see, he receives no more inspiration or understanding in the conclusion of the film, either than us, or of him when he opens up his son's notebook, which had been stolen away, hidden away underneath the desk. And it's like that scene in A Serious Man when he finally discovers his brother's notebooks, and they're almost incoherent. Here, the incoherence is that everything has been erased, everything has been written, and everything has been unwritten. So it's a kind of almost like referential palimpsest of, wow, what is going on with this particular multivalent moment. I I think that the transformation of the child, Chaim Aron, and his inability to move from death, from birth to life to death to life to death, in the kind of recursive, iterative way that it's described there, is in some sense chiastically almost ensconced by the father, because the movie begins with the father also. And it begins with death and his father as an agent of death. And there, I think, a more interesting image to me than the crocodile was the image of the cow. And three particular scenes that stuck out to me there are the killing of the cow in the very beginning, which is largely implied, although it's its own kind of shower scene where we get the blood on the wall. Then there's the death of the cow, and you see its tremors until it dies, and the inability of it, the fact that it doesn't die instantly, but it kind of lingers in ways that are very unwelcome. It's almost like that horrible scene in the Ewige Jude, the anti-Jewish propaganda film where they show slaughter. It felt almost like that. And then the third, which is the inflation of the lungs, which is a scene I don't know exactly what to do with. Where one of the kosher slaughterers is inflating it, and they declare it to be non-kosher. So get rid of it. It doesn't matter. And is that supposed to be Chaim Aaron? He's not kosher. He's inflated with life again by the father, but then they cast him off. I'm not exactly sure. But that feels like a very sort of, how do we say, field-specific Jewish image, the sort of like the slaughterer who, again, like Abraham, like the biblical patriarch with the ma'achelet, the flesh-eating knife that he doesn't apply to his child. Here it's sort of playing with and inverting that.
So Ariel, you mentioned the father, and that reminds me that one thing that's very striking at the end when you have the father in his tallis and tefillin or prayer shawl and phylacteries is the way he's posed looks very much like Chagall's portrait of a praying Jew, which exists in several versions. The shot is kind of effectively reversed, but otherwise it's exactly that same moment. And so to Gabriella's point, if what we're seeing in here is a kind of Hasidic styling of the Hasidic, taking the secularization as the kind of base point for your own version, then here too, it's kind of with this allusion to Chagall of kind of looking back into the tradition in order to move it forward. So we've shockingly spent a little bit more time talking about Tikkun than the Dybbuk, given the weight of the Dybbuk. And so maybe I'll ask a very generic question about that, which is that this is unquestionably one of the most consequential texts of modern Jewish literature, the play. And the film has long been seen as one of the few masterpieces of Yiddish cinema. So earlier I asked about horror and whether that framing brought anything new to the film. Now I want to ask a far more basic question. Was there anything new that you noticed on this viewing? Were there parts that struck you as being more or less salient than they had before? To give a specific example, I was really taken this time by the film's kind of gender politics, and specifically the impossible love between Sender and Nissen that serves as the generative, inciting incident of everything that happens after. And it's this transposition of one impossible love onto another, and also the particular use in which the fade and the camera going in and out actually enables this kind of development. So again, were there any elements of the story that really struck you on this viewing, in a way that they hadn't before? Or if not, since I've already mentioned it, maybe we could discuss a little bit more about the role of gender in the film.
Yeah, that is actually what I was thinking this time, that, this kind of forbidden love between the two fathers at the beginning of the Dybbuk film, which is different from the movie, from the play, right? The play doesn't begin with that. And as far as we know, the first draft manuscript version that we have of the play begins with this conversation between a father and a daughter, right? So the daughter is like gone away, like a kind of prodigal child, and then she comes back, and the father says, I'm taking you back, and I'm going to tell you the story, right? So it's very much about that kind of father-child relationship, and not about the two men. People speculate that Washinsky, who was apparently gay, that there was he was himself like drawn to these. It's no accident that the film begins with this kind of homoerotic scene of the two future fathers, as we hear the erotic sounds of the Song of Songs. So yeah, that seemed really striking to me this time. And but also I was thinking, oh, this is so pretty. This is such a nice example of such an aesthetically pleasing depiction of forbidden love or forbidden sexuality. And that's so different from Tikkun, in which the forbidden sexuality is really made very unattractive. And so, yeah, it's just aesthetically really different. I was thinking a long time ago in grad school, after studying for the summer, a couple summers in a row in Krakow in Poland, I watched this actually really great Polish Jewish film, Austeria, by the filmmaker Kawalerowicz. And it's from the early 80s. It's a really interesting film. I ended up writing an article about it. And part of what I wrote about was realizing that filmmaker was doing maybe something really similar to what Tikkun does with the Dybbuk, with the film of the Dybbuk, in that for Kawalerowicz, what was accessible, the accessible kind of trace of sort of Jewish culture that he could access and work with was that film. That was the thing he had. So so he made Austeria kind of full of references to the Dybbuk, and with some similar references to the ones that appear in Tikkun, the dancing, the outfits, the hats, the particular sort of way of seeing the hats. So I think there's something, I think watching the Dybbuk after watching Tikkun I watched kind of with fascination and indeed horror. And then I was like, the Dybbuk, such a relief. But I watched it and thought, oh, it's just full of stuff you can use. It's so, maybe because it was made by, as a kind of patchwork, Ansky collected stories and songs and images and all this stuff. And then he maybe kind of mechanically, especially in the early drafts of the play, sort of stuck these things in like a museum. And then, later drafts of the play and the movie are a little bit less of a patchwork and a little bit more of a kind of aesthetic whole. But those traces of patchwork mean that it's very easy to lift something out of it and put it in your modern thing.
Ariel, same question. Was there anything that struck you new this time?
Again, I think the juxtaposition allowed me to see something really interesting, which is that, I have always been fascinated with the opening scene of the Dybbuk, in which, the obvious unstated power of these two men singing Shir HaShirim to each other, sort of overturning the classical interpretations of that, both theologically and also even if you read it according to the plain sense, which is the text of the love and embodied landscape of the lover and the beloved. What was so striking to me about the Tikkun and following on the footsteps of that is that the forbidden love or the forbidden sexuality of Tikkun is heteronormative. It's all sexuality. And there are many stories that are specific to, there was a recent short movie called Black Hat about this, about Hasidic men in particular who struggle with homosexuality. The homoeroticism of that culture has long been noted, and especially in the late 20th and early 21st century, as the attempts to tamp down sexuality in any event have taken off. This is also true for stories exploring the sexual and religious lives of young women in that community. But Tikkun takes a different tack, which is trying to understand the nature of all human sexuality, whether that is masturbation and autosexuality or that between a man and a woman. That's what the movie kind of gets stuck on, or that's what the movie is really trying to interrogate, and the impossibility of the flourishing of Eros because the Thanatos is so strong. I guess that's how I would put it, is really the theme of the film. And I think that also comes out in the scene of the dance, which, the beauties and the the tremendous power of the dance and the dance of the dead in the Dybbuk. Here, the fact that Chaim Aron is not dancing with the spirits, and he's not a part of that. He's on the outside. He's the miscreant who can't find a way in. He's a miscreant who can't join the tumult, which it almost feels like the director could have green screened a real simcha. It definitely feels like it was totally authentic, and he's on the outside of everyone else. That's it cements the position of Chaim Aron as someone who is not grappling with these things as they are in the Dybbuk, but really as a liminal character, which again is a great theme of the Dybbuk, but it takes it in a different direction.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll close with this great one that we got in the chat, or in the Q&A, I should say, since those are separate Zoom functions. So both of these movies have truly exceptional cinematography. And as I said before, I think that Tikkun would be almost nothing without Shai Goldman's exceptional work. And Shai Goldman is a secret weapon for some of Israel's best filmmakers. And actually, next quarter, we'll be talking to Nadav Lapid, one of Israel's leading contemporary filmmakers, and I'm going to ask him about working with Goldman. So stay tuned. But there's more than one photographic eye at work in the Dybbuk. The movie was kind of brilliantly shot by Albert Verka, but it was also adapted for the film. But it was also adapted by Alter Katzizna. Katzizna was kind of this figure of stewarding the play's publication, and he wrote the screenplay. And he was also one of interwar Poland's most striking photographers of Jewish life, although only a fraction of it remains for us today. So what do we make of Katzizna's presence here? Is he a co-creator, a co-conspirator? Would it even be possible to kind of untangle what he might have added to the film's visual identity?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think of Katzizna. I think I first saw Katzizna's photography. I don't remember the name. There's some album that has it that's like, here's the world of before the Holocaust. Right? What's the name of that album? That's very accessible. But so you see Katzizna as that kind of photographer. And then it was funny doing the research on my biography of Ansky to find Katzizna as like this young guy writing to Ansky for advice and saying, I think what Katzizna writes to Ansky, the letters I found in the archive were about, I'm trying to be a writer in Yiddish. It's actually really hard. So he's kind of endearing and so clearly an outsider, an ethnographer. And so I guess to me, it seemed really nice. Like I was satisfied as someone who sees this film from the perspective of Ansky and who wants to kind of draw it back into that earlier context and insist that we see it as a product of the late imperial Russian Empire, as opposed to seeing it as something telling us about the Holocaust from across the boundaries that we can never go back to. There's some way that I want to drop back into the Russian Empire, and so knowing that it was kind of facilitated by Katzizna and that he was kind of a person from that same world as Ansky, I like that.
So let's close with Larry's question. Well, there are two. One, what are the acting traditions that the performances in the Dybbuk come out of, especially the non-realistic, very non-Stanislavskian ones, the Meshulach and Liachonin? And two, are there any comments on Hanoch's score, which seems to me brilliant creative innovation within the constraints of a traditional style? And I'll just simply add to that, that I think that there are moments when it's nicely evoking horror movie scores of the period.
Yeah. The score is great. And the score is definitely, something that gets harvested by other filmmakers. And there are bits of that same score in Kavalerovich's Austeria, for instance, but it's not only there. Yeah, the acting tradition, I don't know if it's really not, I mean, it's non-Stanislavskian in that it doesn't fit with our notion of like method acting and kind of mid-century Hollywood, but the intriguingly, as far as we know, the productions of the Dybbuk in Hebrew in the Habima performances from 1922 at the at the Hebrew studio of the Moscow Art Theater were also very mannered and non-realistic. And I mean, it was on the stage, so it didn't have the magically appearing and disappearing Mashulach, which is amazing. But it did have that kind of very striking use of black and white costumes, very striking kind of unrealistic use of, lighting. It was not trying to be ethnographic. It was trying to be shocking. Right. And then the film does that same thing. I think that there's something about so the acting traditions that came out of, I think there's something about the use of sort of folkloric texts involving death in the 1930s that maybe just make people think about Nosferatu and the ways in which expressionist film provides was already providing models for cinematic treatment of that kind of stuff, and I think that allows for this. I mean, even campy, I guess it's not campy, maybe our attitude toward it can be campy, but it's this sort of over-the-top, unrealistic, spooky, non-nuanced kinds of, the use of their voice and the use of their bodies. They're so unnatural looking. And I think that was part of the cinematic vocabulary that Washinsky gets from, say, Nosferatu. Yes. Oh, thank you, Zachary. Yes. Avram Moravsky is a veteran of the Vilna Troupe. Yeah. So it's there, all these different iterations of the play and the film, they're all connected to each other, and taken together, they allow us to understand how complex ethnographic art could be, and how unrealistic it could seem, and yet still, accomplish what it was trying to accomplish.
So Ariel, any final thoughts on score before we bring this to a close?
I didn't find Tikkun's score to be particularly memorable. It was somewhere in between the Blair Witch Project and Pi, other films that I would put it into conversation with. What can't we say about the score of the OG campy film, The Book? But I did want to pick up on what you said about the cinematography of Goldman. I think that, you could sort of peel away many of the layers of Tikkun, and that carries the day. And from what I know, Goldman is known for a few things. One of them is beautiful landscape shots on display, haunting indeed. The other is, at the same time, another is being able to capture the complex, almost claustrophobic nature of life, especially in Israel, and of what it means to live in close quarters, oftentimes with people that you are in complex relationship with. That, I think, is very much on display. He also uses long shots to great acclaim and to great effect. And those are some of the more uncomfortable dimensions of the movie. I think that's also another key dimension of horror films is the discomfort is provocative. And unlike I would say the last third of Tikkun, which I felt like he was grasping, Sivan was like sort of grasping to try and get us more and more uncomfortable, not in the way of a slasher film, but in the way of a movie like, again, Lynch. Goldman uses long shots that make us uncomfortable in order to provoke reflection inescapably. We're not exactly looking in a mirror, but we're not exactly looking through a window. It's something in between the two, and that's very hard, and it's very powerful. And that in the opening space, that sort of space that is opened before us, is some of the most powerful work that horror can do. That's where I think Stephen King and that story that I shared earlier about the fact that, you know, there's a reason that the definition of horror can be so expansive, because so much of human culture is indeed grappling with some of the questions that really lie at the heart of that genre.
So I think that's a fantastic note to end on. So Ariel, Gabriella, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your thoughts on what may or may not be an actual genre, but it was at least an interesting counterpoint of movies to talk about. So
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Eitan, for putting this together. Thank you, Shayna Hammerman and the Taufi Center for creating this series and pulling me out of my comfort zone.
That sounds good. We'll be back next quarter. Watch your email for more information.